ARE Podcast, episode number 41.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. ARE Podcast, where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 41 of the ARE Podcast. We are back, which seems to be something we say fairly frequently on this podcast. But we have a great episode today. We're going to talk all about my recent trip to Nepal, and Eric is going to ask me some questions. And it was a perspective-shifting trip, to say the least. I just got back last week, digging out of my inbox for, this past week and getting caught up. So we wanted to record this while the experience was still fresh. So, of course, we're joined by Eric. Eric, how are you?
I'm great.
Did I miss anything exciting while I was gone?
No, but I got to be you for the 2 weeks you were gone, answering the emails for architect exam prep, and it's awful. It was just when I talk to the candidates, it's always fun, and I'm coaching them. When you have to deal with the candidates, you're dealing with all the customer service crap of, I want this and I want a discount and all that crap. Yeah, it was rough. I couldn't wait for you to get back.
Yeah, see, now you appreciate me a little more.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I'm going to turn the questioning over to you, and we'll jump into talking all about Nepal.
So you just came back from this arguably life-changing experience. Why did you want to do this? This is something that you wanted to do last year, and you had to postpone it. Why Nepal? What did you want to do there? Tell us how that started.
It's interesting. The whole thing started last fall when I was at the climbing gym in LA, Sender 1 LAX, and I saw just a little flyer on the bulletin board about doing this trip to Nepal, helping rebuild a school, and you go trekking in Nepal. And I was like, oh, that's cool. So I emailed this woman, Candace Young, who's like this 29-year-old entrepreneur, amazing person. And, I'd been wanting to go to Nepal for a while. I've been intrigued by it. But I think in the bigger picture of why, I think it was finally the time in my life when I felt sort of like my home area, like everything is set and it's time to, give back and really sort of figure out, looking more for my purpose, I guess, is part of it. Rather than just my little unit. So that was happening last year, and then kind of stumbled upon the Nepal poster, and then it kind of just started to come together that way. And I think it was looking for bigger why.
And Candace is, I kind of Googled her and the Trek Relief site, and she's a pretty impressive person. She's been in 40 countries, and she's not even 30 yet, right? And now she kind of created this organization to help people around the world.
Yeah, so Trek Relief she created a couple years ago, and she started going to Nepal, I think about 2013. And the big part of this story in Nepal is the earthquake that happened in 2015. So she was there just kind of exploring Nepal before the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, obviously she revisited again and wanted to help. And I think that's kind of Trek Relief was born out of that. It just had its 2-year birthday. And part of what we did on this trip was talk to earthquake survivors. And what was interesting is, to them, 2015, it was in April, and I think the earthquake happened, I think it was like 11:55 a.m. on a Saturday. It's like their 9/11. People remember where they were when it occurred. And Nepal is one of the poorest countries in the world to begin with. And then you add in this really devastating earthquake to a country that doesn't necessarily have, the strict building codes and the infrastructure. It was devastating.
Yeah, they do seem to talk about it as this defining moment in history before earthquake and after earthquake, in terms of the relationship of the country.
They do. And what's interesting about Nepal, so we hired or part of the Trek Relief program was, we raised funds to help rebuild a school. Now, in rural Nepal in the Langtang Valley, or you can say Langtang Valley, it's north of Kathmandu. And in the Langtang Valley was the epicenter of the earthquake, and it was like, I think, a 7.8 or an 8.2. And what it did is there's this one village, Langtang, completely wiped it out. There was the earthquake triggered an avalanche, which buried an entire village. I think, over 175 people perished. Bodies were never recovered because, they were buried in the rubble. Kathmandu, which is the capital of Nepal, had some, damage as well, but not nearly as what was felt in really rural Nepal. And Nepal, in and of itself, is a very corrupt country. And, one of the guides that we had, he was great. I was able to pick his brain about Nepal culture and how things really work in Nepal. It's a corrupt government. I think they had something like $4 billion in aid come in after the earthquake, $4 billion with a B. And it sounds like most of that money didn't make it to where it needed to go. And especially these villages didn't really see much at all. And so a lot of the villages are still, recovering.
And then did you study all this ahead of time? Did they send you a kind of a primer or a packet of information, or did you just learn it you just showed up and learned it all firsthand?
I most of it, I think I just learned firsthand. As you mentioned, the trip was supposed to happen in November, and that was a trip that Candace had going. She wasn't leading that one to rebuild the school. I couldn't make that one because of work stuff. So then she's like, well, you can come on the one in March, and I'm actually leading that one. So that's the one I went on. So we did the fundraising last fall, and those of you may remember, we had a sale a couple of days that we announced on Instagram. I think we offered our packages at 50% off, and then we donated the entire proceeds to the fundraising campaign, which means we raised $6,000 for this effort. She said, I was the highest fundraiser, in Trek Relief since they started 2 years ago. So that was cool. And that, yeah. And that was really part of the ARE community who did that. So the project is rebuilding a school, and it's not a school like when we think of here in the States school. It's a small building, 5 small rooms, 1 story. But what's interesting is it was completely destroyed in the earthquake. It was a Saturday when the earthquake happened, so thankfully kids weren't in the school, but the school was completely destroyed. I'll be posting pictures on Instagram, of the progress. But Candace and Trek Relief are the only ones who have donated to this school. She raised for this school essentially $50,000, which is interesting to me because I don't think you can build much here in the States for $50,000. But in this rural town, it's called Sirubesi. It's about 8 hours north of Kathmandu. You have to ride on a bus for about 8 hours on a rough dirt road. And these are like 4-wheel drive buses. And it's a very rough road. I think one of our members, there were 7 of us on the trek. One of them got kind of motion sickness on the way out there. But it's rural. But $50,000 is enough to rebuild this school. And what they did last fall is they worked on the foundation. And then when we got there, we worked a day on building the block wall. And it was really interesting to see because they're not really using power tools. They're taking rocks from the site and they're forming them, with their little hand hammer pickaxes, and we were doing some of it. We weren't very good at it or efficient. And then mixing the cement and the mortar and the sand for the mortar. And we laid a bit of a block wall. And then we went trekking for 5 or 6 days, and then came back, and they have a crew there now, and they had I think had like 3 or 4 feet done on one length of the wall. I don't know the dimensions of the school. Maybe it's like 25 feet by 80 feet. Maybe it's a little longer than that. And then it's divided into 5 rooms. So these are small rooms, 1-story building, but it's traditional stone that's on site with mortar. And a
single, there's not a cavity wall here. It's like a single wide wall, right?
It is. And, and we met with Buddha, the architect, was this really nice guy from Kathmandu. He came out and he spent several days out there. And it was interesting. So, yeah, it's a single cavity wall. It's stone. I guess it's some form of granite. And one of the things that happened in the earthquake is a lot of these walls these in this particular area collapsed. But they would sort of bow out. And one of the things they're doing in this particular wall is like every 4 feet, they're taking a stone. Let's say the wall is, maybe 16 inches wide. They're taking a longer stone. Let's say it's 16 inches long, and they're turning it so it spans across the width of the wall. So they're doing this, I think, every 3 or 4 feet. The idea that'll keep the wall from splitting, because normally when they were laying it out, it's one stone on one side, one stone on the other, and in the middle is it's a joint. It's still one cavity wall, but since they didn't have like that keystone, what you had is a line of stone, a line of the mortar, and then another line of stone. That's your 16 inches. So you kind of had a seam down the middle.
And was it? Did it course? Like I used to, as you know, I used to live in Santa Fe, and we built a lot of adobe houses. And even though the adobe bricks are pretty consistent, they're all made in the same forms. They're baked in the sun. They arrive on the site in a big pile, like CMU. But once they start laying them out, they crumble, they break, they're uneven. There's no way they course out.
No, they don't necessarily course out. And especially there's nothing manufactured here, obviously. It's just the stones that are on the site. And they're just knocking them, and they're using kind of the bigger stones, like, let's say are 8 inches high or about that. And they are, they're chipping them. This guy with his hammer, he's like chipping it to get it, to match the existing height of the stone that they've already laid. So they're really, they're using the one they laid previously, and that's what they're lining up to. It's laborious. It's very hard work. And, these guys are working like 11 hours a day doing it.
It's funny because I've seen this in other parts of the country, and in Santa Fe, it was interesting because adobe was so commonplace, and it was such a common skill set. It was as common as just framing, to everybody on the site. And what I noticed is they spent a lot of time, the foundations were professional foundations, normal foundations like you'd see on any house. And they spent a lot of time laying the sill and the base course for the adobe, and that they were very precise with that. But then once the base course was laid, then they just let it rip. And since they weren't trying to get it to course out or look neat, it was just hard labor, but it wasn't very precise work. It was taking like a little Shawshank Redemption type hammer and chipping the mud blocks and fitting them, and it looks good. And knowing that eventually it'll get to some height, and then we'd kind of cap it with a concrete bond beam, and that would cause everything to quote unquote course out at the end.
It was interesting because it was like that with a little Shawshank Redemption hammer. Each level was coursing out. And then they would use mud or mortar to kind of infill a little bit. But
you're an architect and a contractor and a professional backpacker and rock climber guy. Were you just their ultimate dream candidate to go on this trip? Because I can't imagine that the other group that was in your cohort were all those things, or any of them, really.
Well, so this is what's interesting, and I don't even know if you and I have talked about this. By the way, I took a whole bunch of pictures, and I'll be, posting them on Instagram. I know you haven't even seen them yet, Eric, and I took a lot of cool details and stuff like that. So there was 7 of us on the trip. So 5 of them were already kind of like a core unit. They hadn't been on Trek Relief treks before, but they were friends of Candace's. And these 5 were already burners. They went to Burning Man last year. They were their tight little clique. And then myself and this guy, Mario, joined the trip. And here's the funny part. And you guys, our audience, will appreciate this. So Mario was 25. We had another woman who was 25. And then Candace is 29. We had another 29-year-old. And then we had a 30-year-old and a 31-year-old. So basically, there's 7 people. I'm 47. Everybody else is like 30 or below. So it was really interesting for me to spend, 2 weeks with these 30-year-olds. And it was refreshing. They were fire spinning every night. And it was just crazy. And like the porters lugged kerosene along the trail so they could, fire spin in their fire tools. It was just really refreshing to see that spirit and that zest for life. And I told them last night we had our big dinner, and I was like, really appreciative of you guys. I didn't expect sort of, I knew the Nepal side and what we're coming for and all that, but the really just getting spend time and see life through a 30-year-old was just refreshing. And I told them, don't lose that spirit when marriage and kids come along, because, most of us do.
Did they call you Grandpa?
No, they did not. I was the strongest hiker in the group. I kicked their butt.
And then, did you have an urge to redesign their current design, or tell them a better way to build the wall, or any of that stuff?
No, God, not at all. It was so interesting to me, and Buddha was so excited to show his plans, and he spoke pretty good English, so we were able to communicate. No, it was just the whole process was just fascinating to me, and it was very humbling. Like, we're in this school, and I think I did post the footprint of the foundation on Instagram already. It's not a big school, but just to be there and be on the job site and work with these workers who are doing essentially everything by hand is very humbling. And like, when we came back after the trek, this woman, she had to be 85 years old. She was sitting next to this rock pile. In what she was doing, she was taking the rocks on site that might have been a foot by a foot, and she's taking her hammer and she's breaking them all down to essentially make gravel, to make like 5 or 6 pieces out of each rock and just throw them in a pile, and then she'd get another rock. I mean, it was just so simple. And it was then that I found out, I asked Candace, well, who else, has raised money for this school? And she said, nobody, it's just Trek Relief. And I was like, wow. So it's kind of like, because really of Candace's vision, she's the one who essentially rebuilt this school, or is rebuilding this school. Otherwise it wouldn't have happened. Yeah. And there, there's a couple other schools in that village up on the hill. And we went and visited them. And we visited the school kids, and they were newer buildings. They were built in the last couple of years, and a lot of the kids live there. It's like a boarding school, because the surrounding villages, you can't just walk to school every day. So the parents have to send their kids, to essentially this boarding school. And Sirubesi is a very rural part of Nepal. But there's smaller villages outside of that, because they had this little, main street, and nothing's paved here. It's all dirt roads for the most part. But it was really exciting to see the kids. We hung out with the kids for the afternoon. The group I was with spun fire for them, so they were excited by that. They were excited by the iPhone, and we were taking pictures and stuff. But these kids literally have nothing. They're playing jacks with rocks, and happy, So it was really fun to, kind of just spend time with them. And we met somebody else on the trail who they donated a bunch of beds to this school. I think he said like 50 beds to this particular school. He goes, before that, they were just sleeping on the ground. So that's the perspective shifting part. But to be there and see how much like what one person can do or a couple people can do to these little villages, like it really matters. I think it's harder to see that kind of impact here in the States, or at least from my perspective. I'm sure there's maybe similar projects in the States, but it's just a whole nother poverty level, I think, in Nepal.
There's obviously poverty in the States that's severe, but the expectation is different, and that's the striking part. When I was in New Orleans right after Katrina and touring the Ninth Ward, and there's still bodies in the buildings and stuff, it was there was this expectation somebody's going to come and rescue everything, and I think after a year or two, when nobody came to really save anything and the Ninth Ward was still hit like a war zone, the Americans that were there, which is everybody, but the Americans were like, oh, I guess our expectations were wrong. What I've discovered in other countries is they didn't have that sense of expectation that anybody, they knew they were on their own right from the start. It took New Orleans in post Katrina a couple years to realize they were on their own.
Exactly. And my guess is it's similar stuff in Puerto Rico, right? Where the federal government has just really forgotten them. And until you kind of see that kind of stuff, it's just, I don't know. And the other thing that was cool about particularly the helping rebuild the school, obviously our contribution was mainly in monetary funds. We volunteered one day, and then we went back, visited, and kind of helped out the second day. But it was really, our monetary backing. But what had happened is the project had stalled, actually. There was some foundation work done in November, and then the project stalled. And because there was a new war chief who was elected. So they have a war chief and they have a village chief. And so a new war chief was elected. So then there was not great communication between Buddha, the architect, and this now new war chief in terms of money handling, because Buddha was the one controlling the money. And it was kind of it would just kind of stall the project. So when we went there, one of our first nights there in Serubesi, is Candace had a meeting with the village chief and the war chief and the principal. And the principal spoke pretty good English. The war chief and the village chief did not. And then our guide was also there, Makunt. He spoke fluent English. And Candace invited all of us to this meeting. So all 7 of us, and the village chief and the war chief and the principal, were all at the village chief's little hotel in the lobby. And we're having this meeting of trying to move the project forward. And it was really fascinating. And Candace can speak, some Nepalese. So she's able to kind of communicate with them. She's definitely able to talk enough to them to relate, and their smile. And it's really neat to see. And so we participated in that meeting for like an hour and really solved the issues in this communication. And then after that meeting, that's when, now the workers are starting to show up again, because now the money's situated. And that's why a bunch of work happened in the week we were, gone trekking. And I think it's supposed to be finished now before the end of the year. But it was really neat just to see that process. And one of the things that came out of that is the village chief said, well, the community is really concerned how the money's being used. And which was interesting to me, because it's really Trek Relief's money that Trek Relief is donating, to fund the school. So in some respects, the community has no say. However, you can't just go in and say that. But I think what also the community was concerned about, they were concerned about transparency and with the corruption in Nepal, they were probably just concerned, is the money being used to build this school? So all that stuff got hashed out. So it was just really neat to be part of it and just to see it and just to hear the stories. For example, the village chief, and I have pictures of these guys too. You'll see them all on Instagram. He's from Cerebesi, grew up there. He's like 44. And, he was in town when the earthquake hit and all that. It was such a small scale thing. It was such a small, intimate scale to be part of. I think that was one of the most interesting parts. Because oftentimes in architecture here in the States, or any project, they're really big projects. And we don't see that sort of intimate sort of client end side where these people are just trying to build this little school,
I used to share office space with Architecture for Humanity in San Francisco.
Right.
Back when, that was kind of in their heyday, when everything, at that point, Cameron Sinclair, he had already won the TED Prize, which was, I think, 2005. It was a great office. It was, it was in a crappy neighborhood, but it was a great office with a great energy in it. Everybody was doing something interesting. And then half the office was all Architecture for Humanity folks. And the other half were, people like me trying to do something, kind of in those same lines. And it's interesting because they would come back from wherever they were, they'd build a school here, they'd build a hospital here, that kind of thing. And they talked about it in the same way you just talked about it. The scale is intimate. There's a whether you like it or not, there's an emotional quality to it that's different if you're, let's say, a production builder in Pomona cranking out 300 units a day. It's by nature, to me, it was a totally different type of architecture, and one that was inherently humbling because it wasn't where you go, well, we'll just have that custom made, or we'll just have that fabricated. It was more like, what do we have available? What can we use in terms of material, skill, local talent on the ground? It was just a very different mindset and approach to design and building that they would describe. And I got to experience it a couple times, never in Tibet, but you're using the same words that they use, which is interesting.
That is interesting. And it's Nepal, by the way.
Oh, Nepal.
You seem to keep thinking I went to Tibet, which is still Chinese controlled. And I don't know if I would have come back from Tibet if I went to Tibet, but it is interesting. And actually, Architecture for Humanity, that would actually be another interesting podcast because obviously they're not around anymore. Or are they around and Cameron just stepped down?
I'm not sure anymore because Cameron left when things were fine and then handed it off to another team. But there was a bit of mismanagement going on, and there were a lot of people pointing fingers. And I don't know. At that point, I moved. So I don't know.
It's interesting too because from sort of, I guess, a architecture business perspective, and I don't know enough of the Architecture for Humanity story, but obviously, Cameron, after a while, felt like it was time to step down. I could see how this would be exhausting work. Even for Candace doing what she's doing, it's amazing. It's a labor of love. So it takes a special person to do this, but I would imagine after a while, it kind of wears on you. After kind of the honeymoon phase wears off, because it's constantly visiting these people who I wouldn't say dire straits, but they just don't have much, and they're just looking for some basics.
This is something that persists with every nonprofit or any humanitarian led effort. That the challenge is that it is draining, but similar to those people that are fighting in a war, you don't want to quit or give up because you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for them, and you'd almost feel like you're abandoning them or leaving them behind, and so that's part of it. But the challenge is, in a certain sense, it still needs to run with the normal physics of a business. So how do you scale your impact? How do you that was, if anything, that was Architecture for Humanity's big innovation was we're gonna run this like an architecture firm. We're gonna design it to scale. We're gonna try to measure our success in the number of projects we complete, just like an architect does, but it's all gonna be for humanitarian causes. And anytime I meet anybody who's in any nonprofit, one of my first questions is, how are you scaling it? And it's it's always very telling given their answer. But it's something that I'm sure Trek Relief is thinking about and struggling with, like every nonprofit does.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Candace has been to Nepal a bunch of times now, and she loves it, which, by the way, it's something immediately I connected with Nepal. We spent like 3 days in Kathmandu and went to Bhaktapur and kind of traveled around, and it's a place I'll return to many times, and hopefully take the boys there next summer. It's a special place. I mean, I've traveled a fair bit, been to Europe, and but there was something special about Nepal. And people are happy there, and it's a third world country, and and that's why, to me, it's perspective shifting, and I think it's humbling, and it's a good reminder of just kind of the simple things in life, and the people that we met were very happy and grateful. They didn't have much, if anything. But they weren't complaining. They were just, this is kind of their life. I forget where I was going with that. What did you say just before that?
Scalability.
Oh, yeah.
Nonprofit.
Oh, so the Longtong Valley, it's north of Kathmandu. It's in Longtong National Park. The trek that we did is through the Longtong Valley. It's a popular trek. We saw a lot of trekkers and trekking companies along the trail, but by no means is it an Everest base camp, kind of area. And our guide, Merkunt, he does a lot of guiding for National Geographic. And there's a handful of National Geographic guides in Nepal, and he's one of them. And National Geographic, they do a lot of treks to Everest base camp. And, these are like $5,000 treks. So he's used to dealing with clients who have high expectations. And he explained the trekking to Everest Base Camp, there's companies that own chains of hotels all along the Everest Base Camp trail. And these people so they put them up in those hotels. He says it's very posh. So everybody has kind of the same hiking experience, but when you get to your hotel, it's a totally different experience. And he said, National Geographic doesn't do treks through the Longtong Valley. It's too rough. There's not those facilities. There's tea houses, these little sparse beds and stuff. But it was interesting to see that perspective. But my point of that was, Candace she's done a couple of treks to the Longtong Valley. She's done actually several. And she's also done Everest Base Camp. And Everest Base Camp was the one where she made the most money in terms of raising funds. She raised funds for a local hospital, medical supplies and stuff. For example, I think she had like 24 people on the Everest Base Camp trek, where she had 7 on our trek on that particular trek. So it's just interesting. And she's looking for her next project. And I think she might do Everest Base Camp again. But it puts it into perspective. Everest Base Camp is easier to raise funds for, but the Longtong Valley, which is in a different area of Nepal, that's the harder draw, right? And then so those villages don't get necessarily the funding from NGOs or get the tourists coming through. So in these little villages depend on tourists. This one guy we met, Lakpa, he is in Kenjin Gompa, which was the last town we stayed in. It was kind of our goal town after hiking for 4 days. It's up about 12,000 feet. And he has called the Dorje Bakery. And
you could be, by the way, you could be making up a lot of these words and I would have no idea.
Right. By the way, learning how to bake at 12,000 feet is feat of its own, and he's an amazing storyteller. He spent 60 minutes telling us his earthquake story and where he was, and I'll tell you quickly. I'll synopsis it. But so he's in Kenjin Gompa, Longtong, which is the village that essentially disappeared, is about a few hours down the trail. And he essentially, when the earthquake happened, he was in his bakery. They had some landslide stuff to deal with. I don't think anybody died in his village, but his mom had a hotel down or a little tea house down in Longtong Valley. So as soon as it happened, he went down there and obviously just saw the boulder field. So he lost his mom, but he has an amazing story. So he went back to Kenchinkompa, and he was the guy who was kind of the rallying cry. So after 3 days, and they have Westerners that were trapped, and Westerners died in the avalanche in Longtong. After 3 days, a helicopter comes in, and the helicopter comes in to take out a couple of the Westerners. And the villagers were all like, no, we have injured people, need to go to the hospital, they're going to die. And the pilot's like, no, I can only take the Westerners. So it was really interesting. And then Lakpa said, now the villagers are all picking up rocks, and they're ready to essentially stone the helicopter pilot because he's not going to take the injured villagers. And he finally did. They convinced him to take the injured villagers, so he took 5 or whatever. And then he went back to Kathmandu, flew back to Kathmandu, and told them that the villagers are irate and nobody should go there. So they were another, I think, 2 weeks without another helicopter coming to render aid or deliver supplies or anything. It was this really just crazy story. And then part of what happened is they had to essentially evacuate everybody out of the Langtang Valley because everybody was afraid they wouldn't sleep in their homes. They'd go stay in caves or whatever because they didn't know aftershock. There were aftershocks, so it wasn't safe. So what was happening is these helicopters were just dropping these the people from Langtang Valley anywhere in Kathmandu. And keep in mind, a lot of these villagers had never been to Kathmandu. They lived in the village their entire lives. Like, this is where they were born, raised, and lived, which is crazy, I think, in the States for us to think about something like that, right? Because we move so much.
Yeah, sure.
So what was happening, there was no effort to keep the Langtang Valley people together. So they were just dropped anywhere in Kathmandu. So then, this is now 6 months later, so now that creates a problem. And then Lakpa, he was the guy who organized in Kathmandu to get the Langtang people all together, and they found like a monastery where they could stay temporarily, and he really brought the Langtang people back together. And then eventually they got back to the Langtang Valley and still rebuilding. But just a fascinating story, and just a fascinating individual, and just how he stepped up in this really crazy crisis, I guess you call it, or just disaster. That there's people like Lakpa that exist is amazing to me.
So then you come back, and then your boys, you as a good parent, you want to impart this to your boys, but then your boys like, Dad, my coconut water's warm, and Fortnite isn't loading, and do you just freak out on them like, kids, do you realize? Do you realize what's going on in the world?
No, you know what's funny is my boys aren't like that at all. They were actually really intrigued with the stories, and no, they thought it was cool. Like, I really sat them down and I showed them pictures and we talked about it, and which I didn't even mention this. So Remy, my youngest, is in 5th grade, and so I asked his teacher if they wanted to write letters to the students. We'll hand deliver them to students in Nepal. So they did that. So they gave us 20 letters. So we delivered 20 letters to the principal in the school, and the principal was so appreciative. And then 16 students actually wrote back. So then we delivered letters back to Remy's class. So, and the principal wanted to keep kind of the pen pal ship going. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that because in rural Nepal, mail is unreliable to begin with. It's almost like we'd have to hand deliver the letters each time. So no, the boys were kind of on board, and they were sort of aware of what was going on and kind of filling them in pre-trip, and then to come back with the letters and come back with the pictures and just tell them how sort of really third world it is. No, it was interesting. So yeah, they want to go next summer, so hopefully we can make that happen. And one of the things that they kind of found funny is there's no, and it's not just a Nepal thing, it's kind of Eastern culture. You don't really sit on a toilet generally. It's a squatty potty, and it's in the floor, so you kind of just have to squat. And I never did get the method down. I had to hold on to things, brace myself, whatever it was. And along the trail are these little tea houses and outdoor toilets, essentially. So there's the toilets, but there's not the running water like to flush a toilet, but there's a spigot next door with a bucket that you flush down and stuff. So the boys got a kick out of that when I showed them the picture of the squatty potty.
I probably wouldn't poop for 2 weeks. I probably would just hold it until I got home.
Actually, with the stuff you're eating, you wouldn't be able to. Thankfully, I didn't get diarrhea, but a few of us did. And it was, as with anybody who has backpacked, know that you just talk about potty talk anyway. But for whatever reason, when you're doing it on the trail trekking in Nepal, like every 20 minutes you're having conversation about somebody's potty something. It's just the way it is. It's like we all become 12-year-olds again. You're pretty advanced hiker, backpacker, camper, rock climber guy. Did you have just the ultimate gear set with you, and were the 30-year-olds in awe of your gear, or were they just as up to date as you were? No, actually, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned this because we haven't talked about this yet. So, what we hiked with, we trekked for I think about 5 or 6 days, usually full days, 8-9 hours. We really hiked with our day packs. So whatever you wanted to put in your day pack, essentially what you needed that day, like because we're up at 10,000, 12,000 feet, so a puffy, winter hat, couple of things, whatever you want accessible during the day. And then our gear, so we had these gear bags, and Trek Relief actually provided the gear bag with a sleeping bag, a heavy down jacket, and a sleeping bag liner. And then we would put whatever else we needed at the end of each day in there, extra clothes or whatever. That's where the porter system comes into place. So the porters would carry this stuff, and essentially one porter would take 2 bags, and they would tie them all together. And when you're in Nepal, we've seen this in the Everest stuff, the Sherpas and all of that. The porter is part of their culture, and I've never. So what this is called a supported. It's called a supported trek. Right? You have support. You have somebody helping you with your gear, carrying your gear. I've never done anything like that. I'm independent. I'll carry my own stuff. However, when in Rome, so this was a supported trek, which is common in Nepal. So there was 7 of us. I think we had 5 porters. I think we had 4 porters. We had 4 porters. We had Mukund, our guide, and then we had an assistant guide, Pemba. And then we had 4 porters. So the 4 porters would carry 7 people's gear, plus they were carrying kerosene and some of the fire spinning toys of the people in our group. And it's crazy because we get all into backpack gear and stuff here in the States. They don't use straps. They just use like this headband thing that they tie all their gear together. So they're carrying it from their forehead just hunched over. That's really how they're carrying like 2 bags.
God, it's got to be rough on the neck.
Right? So I had a good conversation with Mukund about this. I said, look, obviously I'm doing this because this is what the way the trip is organized. But this porter thing, what's the deal? Like, I feel bad. He goes, don't. He goes, you are making such a huge contribution to just the Nepali culture, to the porters, to everybody. He goes, don't, like, this is what we do. And he goes, most of the porters, they porter in the fall and spring season, because summer is monsoon season. So it's really spring and fall. That's their only job for the year. So they're using whatever money they make from portering in the spring and fall, living all year off of. He goes, it's a huge contribution. So it really opened my eyes to that. And the same thing as the guiding. They make their money in the fall and in the spring, and they live all year off that. Nobody's getting rich doing this stuff. And so it's just really fascinating to kind of take in the local culture and understand that. You could do the trek we did. You're hiking to tea houses each day, so you got like a warm bed and stuff. You could do it completely unsupported. Like you could pack your own gear just like a backpacking trip. However, the way it should be done is you hire a guide and you hire a porter. So when I go back with the boys next summer, that's what we would do. If it was somewhere else, we would just carry our gear. But it's just part of what you do. And I think you'd be you'd almost look like a jerk if you went on one of these treks and didn't hire at least a porter,
Right.
maybe not a guide, but at least a porter. These people depend on it. So that was really eye-opening to me. And just happy people. And they like to drink. Roxy is the stuff they drink.
Were you able to keep up?
No. The last night probably, but no, we didn't drink much on the trail actually.
It's very easy to go to a culture that's so different from an Americanized culture. When people go to Canada, it's basically like clean America. They go to Europe, it's like America with subtle differences, and the differences always stand out. But if you go to a place like Nepal, it's so different that it's easy to focus on the differences. What about the similarities? What was similar that you found that you were kind of surprised to see there?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, and this is the first country I've been to that was, I've been to Mexico a few times, but in third world parts of Mexico, but this one was different. Similarities, I think, were just with the people, and how we are all the same, and how, as I was talking to Mukund about this too, like family is very important to the Nepali culture. And they have a caste system there. And one of the things that was interesting, we visited an orphanage in Kathmandu, which was sad. And as you know, Eric, having kids changes your perspective of everything anyway. But the orphanage we went to in Kathmandu, this was a specific orphanage for abandoned kids who were basically either abandoned at the hospital or whatever. They were abandoned at birth, which Mukund explained is kind of a big deal in Nepali culture, because your family is so important, your name is so important, your caste is so important, and these orphan kids don't have that, and they essentially take the name of the orphanage they're at, and then they have to somehow integrate into Nepali society as you get older. But yeah, I think the biggest similarity was just with the people, and just that really realizing we're the same, we have kind of the same desires and needs, and there are no barriers. I would say that was it. In terms of just kind of the infrastructure, Kathmandu is pretty crazy. There's no rules riding on the road. I mean, it's insane. I guess India is like 10 times worse from what some people were saying, because I don't think I mentioned this. Nepal is landlocked. It's a landlocked country, right? So there's no shipping port. China's to the north, India's to the south. So it's sandwiched in between these two big countries. And another thing I was asking Mukund is, do Indians kind of look down on the Nepalese? And he's like, yes. And they also kind of like to lord over them. Like every once in a while, India will stop shipping fuel and whatever. And then Nepal's just stuck. So it's an interesting country for a whole bunch of reasons. But Kathmandu, there's Wi-Fi at your hotel. There's running water. There's the modern conveniences, for sure. So it's just dirtier and dustier.
Yeah.
And I can't even think of an American city like it, because it's just so dirty and dusty. But that's part of the draw. And then we were in Tamil, which is an area of Kathmandu which is very touristy, where you can get your knockoff North Face jackets for like $20 kind of thing. So there's always that. But getting outside of Kathmandu and really getting to the villages was more of that was the eye-opening thing for me. And again, we're all the same. Even if not speaking the same language, just communicating, pointing at things or eye contact or whatever it was. It's interesting though, like Nepalis don't really hug. I was asking Mukund about this too. Like they're not like a hugging culture. So you kind of shake hands.
There's it's interesting because we talk with candidates all day long about their biases that they're bringing to the test, and how their own cognitive biases are getting in the way of them passing the test. What's interesting about when you travel to a country that's so different from a North American, Anglo-centric type culture, is you realize a lot of your biases. You realize the idea of hugging and how far away you talk from people, because all those things are different in these other places. And when you go, you would judge them based on those things. God, this person's talking too close to me, or they're talking too far away, or they're hugging me and I don't want them to, or I want to hug them and they're resistant to it. And you realize there is no right or wrong way to do any of this stuff. It's all stuff that's kind of embedded in the culture that you grew up in, and it's just different. Like in Egypt, when I was in Egypt, and they like to barter and negotiate everything.
Oh, Nepal's the same way.
Yeah, whether the price is posted or not. And having not grown up in that, to me, I found it incredibly annoying, and said every single thing you wanted to do, you had to go through a negotiation. But for them, it was normal, And so this idea of what's normal and what's not goes away completely when you're in a country that's so different from your own.
Yeah, and kind of what's interesting too is being self-aware enough and knowing kind of how they see you. Like, right? We're both white guys, so that alone will affect kind of wherever we travel. Like for example, Nepal. Well, I'll give you an example. We're in Kathmandu. I'm in the shop looking at singing bowls, right? The guy's showing me singing bowls, and he's like, "Where are you from?" And I said, "America." He goes back and he brings out these huge, expensive singing bowls, So they have their own sort of biases towards us. But doing the trek in the Longtong Valley, there was a lot of Europeans on the trail. There was a lot of trekkers. It's a busy trail. We're all tourists in the mind of the people who actually live in the Longtong Valley, but we're also their lifeblood. Us spending money there means they get to survive another day. So it's just interesting to me, as much as we might want that real authentic experience, I guess it's limited on how much we get when we're just the white guy traveling through a village kind of thing, because they're always going to look at it, look at us in a certain way. But Lakpa, at the George A. Bakery, he's, as I said, such an amazing person. He's on TripAdvisor. His bakery is known. And he's just got this really funny story about how he used to make all these mistakes trying to figure out how to bake. And anyway, but one of the last things he said to us said, "Come again." And he goes, "If you come, we live." And it was like that simple. And it's kind of brutally honest, but it's true. Like, we need people to come here to spend money so we can survive. We don't survive otherwise. It's just, it puts everything into perspective. But, wherever we go, we're still the white guy traveling.
And I guess this is an appropriate final question is, are you going to go back, or are you going to do something? There's, obviously other schools, other countries, other needs. Now that you've been back for a couple of weeks and you've had time to process this and you're still going through your photos, like what are you thinking?
I'm thinking I'll definitely go back to Nepal. I would love to take my boys on this Longtong Valley trek, because now I know it and I know they could do it. I would like them to meet Lakpa. I think it would just be cool that they meet him, and I told them some of his story. Which, by the way, I was just thinking of another gentleman we met. He was at the Lama Hotel along the trek. He was like this very leathery 66-year-old guy, the hoarsest voice you've ever heard, he's like a Star Wars character from smoking for years and years. But he told us his earthquake story, and just this really sort of gruff individual, but I got this really great picture of him smiling. But he lost his son in the earthquake, body never recovered. So it's like, damn. But to get back to your question, I'll definitely go back to Nepal. I would like to somehow get more involved there. Trek Relief, their obligation to this school will come to an end. Candace is looking for other opportunities. What I did like about it, and I guess I need more time to reflect on this, is I like the idea of helping a community through helping a school. Because just meeting the school kids, hanging out with them was one of my favorite parts of the trip. And it's kind of like if you can really impact a school, you really affect the entire community. So that has a special place in my heart. And that necessarily isn't a Nepal specific thing. It's more like, wow, if you can really help build a school in some rural village, like that affects everybody. It affects the kids, it affects the parents. And a lot of parents now in Nepal, in these rural villages, understand the value of education, which is why they're sending them to kind of this bigger village, right, Sarabesi. The kids are now learning English in Nepal as kind of a requirement. So, yeah, it just seems like to me, that's a more personal impact than, for example, raising money for the local hospital and a bunch of supplies and all that, which is totally worthy and viable too. There's just something about the school I found that resonated for me. And part of it's kind of sad that Trek Relief is completing this project with the school. Candace is going to do another trip next year, next April, kind of like a big grand opening at the school to celebrate it with the villagers and stuff, and hopefully I'll go to that. But yeah, there's part of me that's sad that particular project is going to come to a close because, yeah, that school, that resonated with me. And that small school and that small scale, we're not talking about, 5 wings. We're talking about one little building, 1 story, 5 little rooms, and that's going to impact the village. One thing I just thought of, as we were finishing our trek, we were coming back to the school because we go right by the school, and there was like 3 or 4 villagers. They're at this water station washing clothes or whatever they were doing, and Candace was behind me, and I kind of walked past them, and then they're like, "Oh, hey," to Candace. They're like, "Hey," and they started chatting, and it was kind of, I didn't see it, but I heard it, and it was the kind of greeting that wasn't just a, "Hey, how are you?" It was like a very warm greeting, and they chatted a little bit. And then we got down to the school, and she explained, like, they recognized her from her previous trips there, and they just wanted to say thank you for building the school, and it was nice to hear, and she's obviously recognized in the community for doing that. So, yeah. That's pretty special.
That's great. Is there... for the people listening, is there any sort of call to action you want to give them? Do you want them to go to trekrelief.org and check it out? Is there something they can do if they want to get involved?
Yeah, one thing you could do is check out one of Candace's trips. She usually does a couple a year, and I think it would be a great experience. I mean, I wish I was doing this in my 20s. And the gist of how her trips work is she has minimum fundraising goals to go on the trip. I forget exactly the number of the trip I just did. Maybe it was like $1,500, $1,800, whatever it was. That's the cost of the trip. Now, you can either just pay that out of your pocket, or you can fundraise for it. That's up to you. And that's how she's raising, money for the stuff. And obviously she encourages you to raise more, because part of what I did when I put this together, I was like, oh, $1,500 to go to Nepal. Like, that's cool. And then when I first started the fundraising and we put it out to the architecture community, I was like, okay, I'll match whatever anybody raises to $3,000, whatever it was. So essentially, obviously I raised more than my $1,500, but I also put in my original $1,500 that I wanted to go on the trip. I didn't need to do that. I had my sort of admission covered by just in the architecture community, but I wanted to contribute my $1,500. So it's a good way, I think, to go on a trip like this and not go out of your own pocket. If you could raise the $1,500 or $1,800 or $2,000 in your community to do that, it's a great opportunity. Which, and on the bag, Candace's slogan, our Trek Relief slogan, is travel with purpose. I really felt that on this trip. I really felt like, wow, we're getting to do this cool trek, but it is with a purpose. Like, we're really helping the local community. So that was special. It was the first time I was able to do something like that. So that would be my recommended call to action, is to check out Trek Relief, see what they do, maybe go on one of their trips. If not able to do that, find some way that resonates with you, because I think as architects, we have a unique view of the world anyway. And I wish I was doing this stuff in my 20s. I was too focused on myself and my career and living the American dream and all that stuff that it just wasn't on my radar. But it is now, and thankful for that.
It's, habit 7 and 7 habits of highly effective people. Habit number 7, the final one, is sharpen the saw. And so this is the type of trip that, you work all the time, life gets in the way, you're studying for your AREs, it looks like they have another trip coming up in November. It really seems to be designed for working professionals to be able to take off, take a 2-week vacation, and instead of doing it sitting on a beach shoving Mai Tais in your face, you could go to Nepal and have a life-changing experience and help people at the same time.
Oh my God, absolutely. And And now, having done one of the trips, Candace is 29. She's an amazing networker, but also realizing if you were to sign up for one of these trips, you're probably going to be around people your same age, which I think is really cool. And again, props off to these 25-year-olds, these 30-year-olds who did this trip. And I told them that too. It's like, it's amazing. Like, I'm 47 and it took me this long to do something like this. Like, you guys are already doing it at 25 and 29 years old. Like, that's amazing to sort of have the capacity to do it. And then that's just going to influence you for the rest of your life.
Exactly. That's great. Okay. Well, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to see all the pictures. For those of you who don't know this, David's actually a really good photographer, and he's got really good cameras. But even with his crappy iPhone, he takes amazing photos. So I'm interested to see some of these. In fact, I suspect that some of them you should probably send to National Geographic or something.
I did get some really good sort of just details of the school build, so we'll be rolling those out on Instagram.
Nice.
All right, so this is where you close it.
Oh, so. Normally I don't do the interviews. So thanks to my co-host David Doucette. I'm Eric Corey-Fried, and that concludes this episode's podcast for the ARE podcast.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the ARE podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.